When I look at the
Ouranopithecus
world
may not
today,
have been a
with
direct
tall
ancestor,
buildings, fast
but it
cars,
shared
and
traits
glowing
and faced
screens,
pressures
it
that
feels
paved the way
almost
for early
impossible to
hominins.
imagine that long
Could this
ago,
powerful
we
ape
humans
represent
were
one of
not
the
even
earliest
here.
roots of the human
The
story,
story of
or
where
is it
we
a
come
distant
from
cousin,
doesn't start
part
with
of
kings,
evolution's
or
branching
farmers, or even
experiments?
hunters.
This was a moment
It
when
starts much
humanity's
earlier,
distinct
in a
path
world
began to
covered in
shine,
forests,
far
when
beyond
apes
what
were
any
the rulers of
Neoscene
the
ape could
trees.
achieve.
That's
The
where the
world was
timeline of
changing
human
rapidly
evolution
around them,
begins,
placing
and
enormous
that's the
stress on
story I
these
want
early
to tell.
primates, forcing some
Millions
to
of years
adapt to
ago,
terrestrial
the Earth
life.
looked very different. Instead of huge cities, there were endless green forests stretching across Africa, Asia, and Europe. Giant rivers flowed quietly, and the sound of birds and insects filled the air. It was in these forests that the first apes thrived. They weren't humans, not even close, but they carried inside them the beginnings of what would one day become us. Scientists say that our earliest ancestors shared a common past with other primates like chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. This doesn't mean we came from the chimpanzees we see today, but rather that millions of years ago, there was a single ape-like species that gave rise to both them and us. If you go back around 7 to 8 million years in time, you would reach the moment where our path split from theirs. That's like the very first fork in the road of human history. The apes living then were built for life in the trees. They had long arms, flexible hands, and strong legs for climbing. Their fingers could wrap tightly around branches, and they moved with ease high above the ground. To them, the forest canopy was home, food, and protection. They ate fruits, leaves, seeds, and sometimes insects. Life was about surviving each day, and they were perfectly suited for it. But even in this world of trees, changes were starting. The Earth's climate was never still. It shifted slowly, shaping life in powerful ways. Around this time, Africa began to dry in certain regions. Forests grew thinner, and grasslands started spreading across the land. The apes had to adapt. Some of them stayed in the thick forests and continued the old way of life, swinging from tree to tree. Others began to explore the edges of the grasslands, where the trees were scattered and food was harder to find. This is where the great journey really began. One of the earliest ape species scientists have studied is called Sahelanthropus jodensis. The name sounds complicated, but imagine a small ape-like creature about 7 million years ago in what is now Chad, Africa. It had a small brain, much smaller than ours, and a face that still looked more like an ape's than a human's. But what makes it special is that scientists believe it may have walked on two legs at least part of the time. That simple step standing upright was the first big change that set our ancestors apart. Walking on two legs might not sound like a big deal today, but for those early apes, it was revolutionary. Standing upright meant they could see above tall grass to spot predators. It freed their hands, so they could carry food, babies, or sticks. It also meant they could travel longer distances across open ground. Of course, they weren't perfect walkers yet, and climbing trees was still an important skill. But this tiny shift was the beginning of something much greater. Not long after Sahelanthropus, another important ancestor appeared, Ouranopithecus, found in Kenya and believed to have lived about 6 million years ago. Its bones show signs of bipedalism too, meaning it also walked on two legs, though not as smoothly as we do. But it still spent plenty of time in the trees, clinging to branches and searching for fruit. It's almost like these early apes were testing a new idea: what if we walked more and climbed less? By around 5.8 to 4.4 million years ago, there was Ouranopithecus, sometimes called Arti. She was discovered in Ethiopia, and her fossils have given us incredible clues. Arti was small, around the size of a modern chimpanzee, with long arms and a grasping big toe that helped her climb. But her pelvis and legs showed she could also walk upright when needed. She lived in a world that was part forest, part open woodland. Her kind was experimenting with both worlds, not fully tree dwellers anymore, but not yet ground walkers like us. When I imagine Arti's world, I see a landscape filled with tall trees scattered across grassy patches. The air was warm, and animals like antelopes and ancient elephants moved across the land. Artie and her kind climbed the trees to find fruit but also came down to walk across the ground to new feeding areas. They were flexible, and that flexibility gave them an advantage. But walking upright had costs too. 2 legs aren't as fast as 4, and it made early humans more vulnerable to predators like big cats. Still, nature seemed to favor this path. Bit by bit, our ancestors became better at living on the ground. The forests were shrinking, and the open spaces were growing. Those who could survive in both places had the best chance. Now, here's something that fascinates me: all of these early apes had brains no bigger than a chimpanzee's, far smaller than ours today. So intelligence wasn't the main difference yet. It was posture and movement. Before we became smart, we became walkers. That shows how small changes can lead to great transformations over time. By around 4 million years ago, a new group appeared called Australopithecus. They were more advanced walkers, spending much more time on the ground than their ancestors. But we'll get to them later. For now, I want to stay with the apes and those very first steps, because that's where the timeline truly begins. Think of it this way: if human evolution were a long movie, the opening scene would not be about tools, fire, or even hunting. It would be about an ape in Africa, standing on 2 legs for the first time, looking out over the grasslands. That moment set everything in motion. Without it, there would be no humans, no history, no me telling this story now. So, part 1 of this timeline is really about that simple but powerful shift from apes who lived only in trees, to apes who began testing life on the ground. Climate change, shrinking forests, and survival needs pushed them forward. They didn't know it, but with each step, they were walking toward becoming something entirely new. When I picture them, I imagine families of small ape-like creatures moving carefully between the trees and the grasslands. The adults keep watch for danger, standing tall on 2 legs to scan the distance. The young ones play, climbing, and chasing each other. They use their hands to pick fruit, maybe even to carry sticks or stones without knowing what those objects could someday mean. Their lives were simple, ruled by survival, but hidden inside their bones was the future of humanity. And that is where the story begins. By the time millions of years passed after Artie and the earliest apes who tested walking, the world was already changing fast. Forests were shrinking more, grasslands were spreading wider, and life was becoming a little tougher for creatures who depended only on trees. That's when a new group appeared, one that took bipedal walking more seriously. Their name might sound long and scientific, Australopithecus, but in simple words, I like to call them the ground walkers. They lived around 4 million to 2 million years ago, mostly in Africa, and they are some of the most famous ancestors in our story. If the earliest apes had only experimented with walking upright, Australopithecus made it part of their everyday life. They weren't perfect runners like humans yet, but they were much better at moving on 2 legs than Artie. One of the most famous fossils ever discovered is from this group. Her name is Lucy. She was found in Ethiopia in 1974, and scientists dated her to about 3.2 million years ago. Lucy belonged to the species Australopithecus afarensis. When her bones were pieced together, people were amazed. She was small, just over a meter tall, with long arms for climbing, but her legs and pelvis showed that she could walk upright almost all the time. It was like looking at a bridge between apes and humans. I always imagine Lucy's world. Picture wide African grasslands, with tall golden grasses swaying in the wind. Herds of antelope and ancient elephants move slowly across the plains. Lions and leopards lurk nearby, waiting for the chance to hunt. In the middle of this wild landscape, small groups of Australopithecus wander together. They look half ape, half human, carrying themselves upright but still quick to climb trees for safety. Walking on the ground gave them new opportunities, but it also made life more dangerous. When predators attacked, they couldn't outrun them like 4-legged animals. Climbing trees was still their best defense. But walking freed their hands, And that made all the difference. With free hands, they could carry food over long distances, hold onto their young while traveling, or even pick up stones and sticks. They didn't yet shape tools the way later humans would, but they were slowly learning that their hands could do more than just grab branches. Another famous Australopithecus is Australopithecus africanus. Fossils of this species were first found in South Africa. They lived between about 3 to 2 million years ago, and they were similar to Lucy's kind but with some differences in their skulls and teeth. These ancestors show that evolution wasn't a straight line. Instead, many different species lived at the same time, like branches of a tree. Some branches survived and grew, while others ended. That's the fascinating part. Our story is not one path but many, twisting and turning. Now, here's something interesting. Australopithecus didn't have big brains. Their brains were only slightly larger than a chimpanzee's, about 400 to 500 cubic centimeters. Compare that to us modern humans have brains about 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeters. So intelligence wasn't their strength yet. Instead, it was adaptability. They could live in different environments, use both ground and trees, and travel across open landscapes. Let me tell you about another amazing discovery, the footprints of Laetali. In Tanzania, scientists found fossilized footprints in volcanic ash that were about 3.6 million years old. When they looked closely, they realized the footprints belonged to Australopithecus afarensis. What amazed everyone was how human-like the footprints looked. They showed clear evidence of walking upright, with a heel strike and toes pushing off, just like us. It was as if time had captured a frozen walk from millions of years ago, showing a family or group moving together across the land. Whenever I think about those footprints, I imagine the moment they were made. The ground was covered with soft volcanic ash after an eruption. A group of Australopithecus walked across it, maybe heading toward food or water. They didn't know that their steps would one day become history, proving to the world that they had taken a giant leap in evolution. Australopithecus lived in groups, probably small ones. Living together gave them safety and helped them share food. They likely communicated with simple sounds and gestures, not language like ours, but enough to work together. Their lives were tough, finding food, keeping watch for predators, and protecting their young. Every day was a struggle for survival, but step by step, they were building the foundation for what humans would become. By around 2.5 million years ago, some descendants of Australopithecus began changing even more. Their jaws and teeth started to adapt differently. Some evolved into robust forms like Paranthropus, with huge jaws and chewing muscles for tough plant food. Others were more slender and flexible, and from these, the first members of our own genus, Homo, would emerge. But that's the story for later. For now, what matters is that Australopithecus was the first real ground walker. They weren't just apes trying out upright posture anymore, they were creatures who lived much of their lives on two legs. This single change reshaped everything. Walking long distances allowed them to explore new areas. Free hands opened the door to tool use in the future. And living in groups helped prepare for social bonds that would later grow into culture, language, and families like ours today. What I find most amazing is how small they were. Lucy, for example, weighed only about 29 kilograms, lighter than many modern kids. Yet inside that small frame was a giant step in evolution. They didn't know they were special. They just lived their lives, searching for food, protecting each other, and moving across the land. But without them, there would be no humans. Think of them as pioneers. They didn't invent fire or build houses, but they were the first to commit to the ground, the first to walk upright day after day. Their footprints are still there, frozen in volcanic ash, reminding us of that ancient march. Every time we take a step, in some way, we are continuing what Australopithecus began. So, in our timeline of human evolution, Australopithecus marks the chapter where walking upright became permanent. From this point onward, every ancestor would carry that trait. The journey had only just begun, but the road was now clear. They were no longer just apes of the trees, they were walkers of the earth. After millions of years of small-bodied ground walkers like Australopithecus, something new began to appear in Africa. Around 2.5 million years ago, a big step forward was made. The ground walkers had laid the foundation, and now evolution was ready to shape the first real humans, the genus we call Homo. When I say humans, I don't mean us, not yet. But these were our direct ancestors, the ones who started to look and act more like people than apes. Their brains grew bigger, their bodies became taller and stronger, and most importantly, they began to use tools. That single change, shaping the world with tools, is what separated them forever from the creatures before them. The earliest known species is called Homo habilis. The name means handy man, because this was the first ancestor we know of who made tools from stone. Imagine a group of small humans, about 1.2 to 1.4 meters tall, with long arms and curved fingers like Australopithecus, but with slightly bigger brains. They weren't geniuses, but they were clever enough to take a rock, strike it against another, and shape a sharp edge. With that, they could cut meat, scrape plants, or crack open bones for marrow. That may sound simple today, but in their world, it was revolutionary. A sharp stone meant survival. It meant they could eat things that no other ape could eat. Marrow from bones was rich in fat, and meat gave them powerful nutrition. These foods helped their brains grow even larger over generations. It was like a loop. Tools allowed them to eat better, eating better allowed their brains to expand, and bigger brains allowed them to invent even better tools. I like to imagine the first moment it happened. Picture a small group of Homo habilis sitting around a carcass left behind by lions. One of them picks up a rock and smashes it against another, breaking it into a sharp piece. He uses it to cut off scraps of meat that the lions didn't eat. His family gathers around, tasting new food. They don't know it yet, but they've just unlocked the secret to becoming human. Homo habilis lived in Africa between about 2.5 and 1.6 million years ago. They didn't travel far yet, but they were explorers in their own way, moving across rivers, plains, and woodlands. They likely lived in small groups, helping each other survive. Their brains were about 600 to 700 cubic centimeters bigger than Australopithecus, but still only about half the size of ours. Another early human species around this time was Homo rudolfensis. Its fossils were found near Lake Rudolph in Kenya. Scientists still debate how different it was from Homo habilis, but it had a larger brain, maybe up to 750 cubic centimeters. Whether it was a separate species or just a variation of habilis, the important thing is clear: brain size was on the rise. Evolution was pushing toward intelligence. But the real game changer came next: Homo erectus. This species appeared around 1.9 million years ago and lived for an incredibly long time, almost until 100,000 years ago. That's more than 1.7 million years of existence. No other human species lasted that long. If Australopithecus were the ground walkers, Homo erectus were the travelers. They were the first humans to leave Africa and spread across the world into Asia and Europe. Homo erectus was taller and stronger than habilis. Some reached heights close to modern humans. Their brains were larger too, around 800 to 1,100 cubic centimeters. But what truly set them apart was their mastery of fire and more advanced tools. Imagine standing near a camp where Homo erectus is gathered. A fire burns brightly, keeping away the night's predators. The warmth comforts them, and sparks rise into the dark sky. They roast meat, making it easier to chew and safer to eat. Around the flames, they share safety and connection. Fire was more than survival, it was the beginning of culture. It gave them light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, and a sense of gathering. Their tools also advanced. Instead of simple stone flakes, Homo erectus created hand axes, carefully shaped stones with sharp edges on both sides. These tools weren't just random, they were planned, showing intelligence and foresight. A hand axe could cut, dig, chop, and scrape. It was like the Swiss Army knife of the Stone Age. Homo erectus also hunted, not just scavenged. With teamwork, they could bring down animals, chase them into traps, and use their tools to butcher them. Hunting required planning, cooperation, and communication. They didn't have spoken language like ours yet, but they likely used gestures and sounds to coordinate. This teamwork was another step toward humanity. Another fascinating thing about Homo erectus is their ability to travel. Fossils have been found as far as Indonesia, China, and Europe. They crossed rivers, followed herds, and adapted to new environments. Wherever they went, they carried fire and tools with them. They were the first true global explorers. One famous fossil is called the Turkana boy, found near Lake Turkana in Kenya. He was a Homo erectus youth who lived about 1.6 million years ago. His skeleton is nearly complete, and it shows that erectus had long legs and a lean body, perfect for walking long distances in the open savanna. When I think of Turkana boy, I picture him running with his group across wide plains, chasing game under the hot African sun. The timeline of human evolution is like a staircase, and Homo erectus was one of the biggest steps. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving, spreading, and adapting. They had culture, technology, and social bonds. They laid the groundwork for everything that came after. But even while Homo erectus spread across the world, back in Africa, new changes were brewing. Around 800,000 years ago, some populations began evolving into more advanced species with even bigger brains. These would eventually become Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, and finally, Homo sapiens. Still, we can't skip past the importance of Homo erectus. They lived longer than any other human species, and during their time, they transformed the way humans interacted with the world. Without them, we wouldn't know fire, we wouldn't have tools, and we wouldn't have the courage to explore beyond our birthplace. When I take a step back and look at this timeline so far, it amazes me. From apes testing upright walking, to Australopithecus leaving footprints in volcanic ash, to Homo habilis shaping the first stones, and finally to Homo erectus carrying fire across continents, it feels like watching a slow but powerful movie. Each chapter builds on the last. Each ancestor adds a piece to the puzzle that makes us human. By the time Homo erectus had already spread across Africa and far beyond, the story of humanity was becoming more complex. Evolution wasn't moving in a straight line, with one species neatly replacing the other. Instead, the world became filled with many different kinds of humans, living at the same time, adapting in their own ways. Some survived for thousands of years, while others vanished into history, leaving only their bones and a few clues behind. This was the age of the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and early Homo sapiens. If you imagine the human family tree, this was the moment when it branched out the widest, with cousins living side by side, sometimes meeting, sometimes competing, and sometimes even mixing. The first of these cousins I want to tell you about is Homo heidelbergensis. They appeared around 700,000 years ago, probably evolving from Homo erectus in Africa. They were taller, stronger, and had larger brains, about 1,200 cubic centimeters, almost as big as ours. Their name comes from a jawbone found in Heidelberg, Germany, but fossils of this species have been discovered in Africa, Europe, and Asia. Homo heidelbergensis is important because they were like the parent species of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. In Africa, they eventually evolved into early modern humans, while in Europe, they gave rise to the Neanderthals. That means we share a common ancestor with Neanderthals, almost like siblings with different life paths. Neanderthals, or Homo neanderthalensis, appeared around 400,000 years ago and lived mostly in Europe and Western Asia. They are probably the most famous of our cousins. For a long time, People imagined them as brutish cavemen, but discoveries in recent years have painted a very different picture. Neanderthals were intelligent, resourceful, and deeply human in their own way. They were shorter but stockier than us, with powerful muscles and strong bones. Their bodies were built for cold climates, perfect for surviving ice ages in Europe. Their brains were as large as, or even slightly larger than, ours. They made complex tools, hunted large animals, wore clothing, and even cared for the sick and elderly. Some evidence suggests they buried their dead with care, which means they may have had spiritual or symbolic beliefs. I often imagine a Neanderthal group gathered in a cave during winter. A fire burns brightly, keeping the cold at bay. Outside, snow covers the ground, and mammoths move slowly across the frozen plains. Inside, families sit close together, sharing warmth, sharpening stone tools, and telling stories in their own language of sounds and gestures. They weren't so different from us. They laughed, they loved, they survived. At the same time, in another corner of the world, another mysterious human group existed, the Denisovans. They were discovered not by skeletons, but by fragments, a finger bone, a tooth, and a few other pieces, found in Denisova cave in Siberia. DNA from these fossils revealed that Denisovans were a distinct human group, related to Neanderthals but different enough to be their own species. We don't know exactly what they looked like, but genetic studies show that they left their mark in modern humans. People in parts of Asia and Oceania today still carry Denisovan DNA, proof that our ancestors and theirs once met and had children together. And then, of course, came us Homo sapiens. The first early Homo sapiens appeared in Africa about 300,000 years ago. They were our direct ancestors, with brains fully developed like ours today. Their skeletons show modern features, lighter builds, smaller brows, and faces more like the ones you and I see in the mirror. But at first, they were just one group among many, sharing the earth with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and even the last survivors of Homo erectus in some regions. What set Homo sapiens apart was not just physical features, but creativity and imagination. We invented new types of tools, blades, points, and needles that were more advanced than the hand axes of earlier humans. We learned to make ornaments from shells and bones, perhaps as jewelry or symbols. We painted on cave walls, leaving behind the first true art in history. These were signs of abstract thinking, of minds that could dream of more than just survival. One of the earliest signs of this creativity comes from Africa, where archaeologists discovered pieces of ochre, a reddish mineral engraved with patterns, dating back about 75,000 years. This wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It shows that early Homo sapiens were already thinking beyond the physical world, expressing ideas and identity. At first, Homo sapiens stayed in Africa. But about 100,000 years ago, groups began to leave, crossing into the Middle East and slowly spreading into Asia and Europe. They carried with them not only tools but also language, culture, and art. Wherever they went, they encountered other humans, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and sometimes, they mixed with them. That's why even today, all of us carry a little bit of their DNA in our genes. Still, something about Homo sapiens gave them an advantage. Maybe it was more advanced language, allowing them to share knowledge faster. Maybe it was their imagination, which let them plan, invent, and cooperate on a larger scale. Over time, they spread farther and farther, until they were the last human species left on Earth. But let's not rush too far ahead. During this age of cousins, the world was alive with different kinds of humans. Imagine walking across Europe 50,000 years ago. In one valley, you might find a Neanderthal family living in a cave, cooking meat over a fire. In another, you might stumble upon Homo sapiens painting animals on stone walls. Far to the east, Denisovans might be adapting to the high mountains of Tibet, their DNA preparing them for thin air. It was a world richer and more diverse than we usually think. I find it incredible that for most of human history, we weren't alone. The image of humans as the only intelligent beings on Earth is actually very recent. For hundreds of thousands of years, there were different humans, each with their own ways of life, sharing the same planet. Some were stronger, some were more adapted to cold, some carried skills we still don't fully understand. Yet, in the end, only one species would remain. By the time Homo sapiens had started to rise in Africa, the Earth was already filled with different kinds of humans. Neanderthals were thriving in Europe, Denisovans were hidden in Asia, and the last echoes of Homo erectus still lingered in a few places. But about 100,000 years ago, something began that would change the course of history forever: the great migration of our species across the globe. This was not a quick journey. It was not like packing bags and moving in a week. It was slow, stretching across tens of thousands of years. Families moved bit by bit, following animals, searching for water, or escaping changes in climate. Step by step, they walked out of Africa and into the wide world, leaving footprints on every continent except Antarctica. The story begins in Africa, the true cradle of humanity. Around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, the earliest Homo sapiens lived there, developing new tools, art, and culture. They learned to fish in rivers, to hunt antelopes on the savanna, and to gather plants and fruits. They were skilled survivors, but also dreamers. They carved designs into pieces of ochre and wore shells as beads. They imagined things beyond the everyday world. By about 100,000 years ago, some groups began leaving Africa. One of the first waves moved into the Middle East. Fossils found in Israel show that humans were already there around 90,000 to 120,000 years ago. They lived in caves, used fire, and shared the land with Neanderthals. Some of these early groups may not have lasted long, disappearing when climates changed, but others continued to push outward. The most successful wave of migration happened around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. By then, small bands of Homo sapiens were traveling along the coasts of the Arabian Peninsula, following the shorelines where food was plentiful. Seashells, fish, and plants provided a steady diet. This coastal highway became their path into Asia and beyond. As they spread, they met other humans. In Europe, they encountered Neanderthals. In Asia, they crossed paths with Denisovans. Instead of replacing them immediately, there was mixing. DNA studies today prove it. Almost everyone outside Africa carries a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, and many people in Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA. Our ancestors didn't just compete with their cousins, they connected with them. Their children carried the legacy of multiple human species, blending into what we are today. By about 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had reached Southeast Asia and Australia. This was one of the greatest achievements of early humans, because it required crossing the sea. Imagine standing on the shore, looking out at the horizon where no land is visible. Somehow, our ancestors built simple rafts or boats and sailed into the unknown. They carried with them fire, tools, and families, and when they landed, they found new animals, new plants, and entirely new worlds. Australia was filled with giant creatures, enormous kangaroos, massive lizards, and even giant birds. Humans had to adapt quickly, learning which animals could be hunted and which plants could be eaten. Around the same time, groups of Homo sapiens were spreading into Europe. This was the land of the Neanderthals, who had survived ice ages and hunted mammoths for hundreds of thousands of years. For a while, both species lived side by side. Archaeologists even found caves in France where signs of both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens occupation exist. Imagine two families, different but similar, living only a valley apart. Did they fight? Did they trade? Did they share ideas? The truth is probably a mix of all three. What is certain is that within about 10,000 to 20,000 years of Homo sapiens arriving, Neanderthals began to disappear. By around 40,000 years ago, they were gone. No one knows the exact reason. It could have been competition, climate change, or even being absorbed into our population through interbreeding. But one thing is clear: after their disappearance, Homo sapiens were the only humans left in Europe. Meanwhile, our species kept pushing forward. By 45,000 years ago, humans had reached Siberia. Around 30,000 years ago, they were in East Asia. And by 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age, small groups crossed into the Americas. How? At that time, sea levels were much lower, and a land bridge called Beringia connected Siberia to Alaska. Herds of animals crossed it, and humans followed. From there, they spread southward, filling the Americas with new life and culture. Think about that for a moment. In less than 50,000 years, our ancestors had traveled from small groups in Africa to every corner of the world. They crossed deserts, mountains, and oceans. They faced freezing cold, burning heat, and dangerous animals. And still, they adapted. One of the reasons they succeeded was creativity. Around this time, we see the explosion of art and culture. In caves in Europe, humans painted animals with incredible detail: bison, horses, mammoths using natural pigments. In Africa, they carved designs into bone and shell. In Asia, they created beads, ornaments, and tools with fine craftsmanship. These weren't just practical, they were expressions of imagination. They show us that humans were thinking symbolically, telling stories, and sharing ideas in ways no species had before. Another reason was cooperation. Homo sapiens formed larger groups than other humans. Language became more complex, allowing them to plan hunts, teach skills, and pass down knowledge. They could share ideas about where to find water, how to build shelters, and how to track animals. This gave them an advantage that no other species had: the ability to learn together and improve across generations. The Great Journey also had consequences. Wherever humans went, they changed the environment. In Australia, many of the giant animals disappeared within a few thousand years of human arrival. In the Americas, mammoths, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats eventually vanished too. Some of this was due to climate changes, but humans played a role as skilled hunters. It shows that even in ancient times, we were shaping the world around us. By the end of this migration period, around 10,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were everywhere in Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas. The world was theirs. They had become the only human species left, carrying inside them traces of the others who had vanished. I like to picture it like this: if you zoomed out and watched from the sky, you would see small fires glowing across the continents. Families huddled around flames, telling stories, cooking food, and preparing tools. Those tiny dots of light slowly spread, connecting into patterns, filling the world with human presence. After humans spread across the world, living in caves, forests, deserts, and mountains, something amazing happened. For hundreds of thousands of years, life had been about hunting animals, gathering fruits, fishing in rivers, and moving from place to place. But around 12,000 years ago, people began to try something new. They started to grow their own food. This was the beginning of farming, and it changed everything. Think about it: before this moment, humans lived as nomads. They followed the seasons, traveling wherever food was found. One month they might live near a river full of fish, the next they might follow herds of deer or wild cattle across the plains. Their homes were temporary tents made of animal skins or small shelters from branches. Every day was about survival. But when humans learned to plant seeds and tame animals, they no longer had to move all the time. They could settle down, build villages, and stay in one place. That simple shift turned hunters and gatherers into farmers, and it was the first step towards civilization. This period is called the Neolithic Revolution, and it began in different parts of the world almost at the same time. In the Middle East, especially in the Fertile Crescent, people started to grow wheat and barley. In China, they planted rice and millet. In Central America, they learned to grow maize, corn, beans, and squash. In Africa, sorghum and yams became important. And in South America, potatoes were first cultivated in the Andes Mountains. It's amazing to think that people in different parts of the world, who didn't even know each other, discovered farming on their own. Why did farming start? Part of the answer is climate. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. Temperatures warmed, glaciers melted, and the environment became more stable. Wild grains grew in abundance, and humans realized they could gather seeds, plant them, and return later to harvest even more. At the same time, animals like goats, sheep, and cattle were tamed and bred. Instead of chasing herds, humans now raised them for meat, milk, and wool. One of the earliest farming villages we know about is Jericho, in the Jordan Valley. Around 10,000 years ago, people built homes there out of mud bricks. They planted crops, raised animals, and even built walls for protection. Imagine walking through Jericho at that time, small rectangular houses with flat roofs, fields of wheat swaying in the breeze, and herds of goats bleating nearby. For the first time in history, humans had a permanent home. Farming brought many benefits. With steady food supplies, populations grew. Villages became towns, and towns became cities. People could store grain for winter, trade with neighbors, and support larger families. But farming also changed human life in ways that were not always easy. Hunting and gathering had been flexible. If one food source failed, people could move on to another. Farming tied people to the land. If crops failed because of drought or pests, whole communities could suffer. Farming also required hard work, plowing fields, tending crops, and guarding animals. People worked longer hours than hunters and gatherers, but the rewards were greater. Another change was specialization. In hunter-gatherer groups, almost everyone searched for food. In farming villages, not everyone had to farm. Some people became potters, toolmakers, or builders. Others became leaders, priests, or traders. This was the birth of social roles, the first hints of organized societies. And then came technology. With farming came the need for better tools, sickles for cutting wheat, plows for turning soil, and grinding stones for making flour. Pottery became essential, not just for cooking but for storing food and water. Fire, which had been discovered long ago, now had new uses: baking bread, firing clay pots, and smelting early metals like copper. But perhaps the biggest change was culture. When people settled, they had more time to create. They painted, carved, and built. They invented rituals and traditions. They honored the land, the animals, and the skies. Temples began to rise, showing that religion was becoming a central part of human life. One of the most mysterious sites from this time is Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Built around 11,000 years ago, it is the world's oldest known temple. Giant stone pillars carved with images of animals were arranged in circles. What's incredible is that it was built before farming was fully established, which suggests that humans gathered for worship even before they settled permanently. It shows that ideas, beliefs, and imagination were just as powerful as food in shaping human history. Of course, farming also created challenges. With more food came more people, and with more people came competition. Villages sometimes fought over land or water. Walls and defenses were built, like those in Jericho, to protect against raids. Inequality also began to appear. Some families had more land, more animals, and more power than others. Leaders emerged, and soon, social classes began to form. But for all its challenges, farming was unstoppable. It spread from the Fertile Crescent across Europe, from China into Southeast Asia, and from the Americas north and south. Everywhere humans went, they carried seeds and animals with them, reshaping the land. Forests were cleared for fields, rivers were controlled with irrigation, and entire landscapes were changed by human hands. When I imagine this time, I picture two worlds side by side. In one, small bands of hunters still chase animals through forests, living as their ancestors had for hundreds of thousands of years. In the other, farmers bend over fields, planting rows of crops, building homes of mud and stone, and preparing for the future. Slowly, the farming world grows bigger and stronger, until it becomes the dominant way of life. By around 5,000 years ago, farming villages had grown into the first real cities. Places like Uruk in Mesopotamia, Mohenjo-daro in the Indus Valley, and Memphis in Egypt were filled with thousands of people. Streets, temples, palaces, and markets appeared. Writing was invented to keep track of trade and harvests. Governments formed to organize irrigation and defense. Human history had entered a brand new chapter: civilization. But we'll save that part of the story for later. For now, part 6 is about that first great shift, when humans stopped wandering and chose to stay. When they planted seeds in the earth and waited patiently for them to grow. When they looked at animals not just as prey, but as partners. When they built homes not just for nights, but for generations. It's almost strange to think that this all began with something as simple as planting a seed. But from that seed grew villages, cities, nations, and eventually the entire modern world. When farming spread and villages turned into towns, something huge began. People were no longer just surviving. They were building, trading, inventing, and dreaming of bigger things. This was the birth of civilizations, and it happened in a few special places around the world, almost like sparks lighting up in the dark. These places are sometimes called the cradles of civilization, because they were where human society truly began to take shape in ways we'd recognize even today. One of the earliest and most famous was Mesopotamia, which means the land between rivers. Those rivers were the Tigris and Euphrates, flowing through what is today Iraq. The soil there was rich, thanks to yearly floods, so crops grew well. By around 6,000 years ago, villages had turned into cities like Uruk, Ur, and Babylon. Imagine walking into Uruk, mud brick houses lined the streets, markets were filled with traders selling grain, pottery, and cloth, and at the center rose a giant temple called a ziggurat, a stepped pyramid dedicated to the gods. Life in Mesopotamia was busy. Farmers grew barley, wheat, and dates. Shepherds raised sheep and goats. Traders carried goods along the rivers, exchanging food for metals, wood, or stones that the land itself lacked. But perhaps the most important invention here was writing. Around 3200 BCE, the Sumerians, the people of southern Mesopotamia, developed cuneiform, a system of marks pressed into clay tablets. At first, it was used to record trade, how much grain was stored, how many sheep were sold, but soon it grew into a way of writing stories, prayers, and even laws. It was in Mesopotamia that the idea of written history began. While Mesopotamia thrived between its rivers, another great civilization was rising along an even more famous river, the Nile in Egypt. The Nile was the lifeline of the land. Every year it flooded, leaving behind rich black soil perfect for farming. Around 5,000 years ago, small farming communities along the Nile united under one ruler, creating one of the world's first kingdoms. Egypt was unique. While Mesopotamia had many city-states often in conflict, Egypt had a centralized rule, led by a pharaoh. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was seen as a god on earth. The people believed he kept balance in the world, ensuring the Nile would flood, the crops would grow, and the kingdom would prosper. And of course, Egypt became famous for its pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Pharaoh Khufu, was a massive project involving thousands of workers. For centuries, it stood as the tallest human-made structure on Earth. But pyramids weren't just tombs, they were symbols of power, order, and the belief in life after death. Egyptians filled tombs with treasures, food, and even boats, believing the dead would need them in the next world. Religion was central in both Mesopotamia and Egypt. People worshipped many gods of the sun, the river, the sky, the earth. They offered sacrifices, built temples, and told myths to explain the mysteries of life. But each land had its own style. In Mesopotamia, gods were often seen as unpredictable and demanding, much like the flooding of the rivers. In Egypt, gods were more orderly and reliable, reflecting the steady rhythm of the Nile. Meanwhile, far to the east, another great society was forming, the Indus Valley Civilization. Around 4,500 years ago, cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro rose in what is today Pakistan and northwest India. These cities were remarkable. Their streets were laid out in perfect grids, with advanced drainage systems, wells, and even multi-story homes. It seems the people here cared deeply about cleanliness and planning. Unlike Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Indus Valley left behind no great pyramids or giant temples. Instead, their achievements were in organization and trade. They made beautiful pottery, seals carved with animals, and jewelry from gold and semi-precious stones. They traded as far as Mesopotamia. Strangely, though, we still can't read their writing. They used a script of small symbols, but no one has ever fully cracked the code. It leaves their culture a mystery, as if their voice is locked away, waiting to be understood. Around the same time, in China, another civilization was taking root along the Yellow River. Early Chinese villages grew into dynasties, or ruling families. One of the first we know about is the Shang dynasty, around 3,600 years ago. The Shang people built cities, cast bronze tools and weapons, and developed a writing system that would later evolve into modern Chinese characters. Chinese rulers claimed the mandate of heaven, the belief that they had the right to rule as long as they governed justly. If they failed, heaven would withdraw its support, and another family could take over. This idea lasted for thousands of years in Chinese history. Each of these civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus Valley, and China, had something in common: they rose where rivers flowed. Rivers meant water for crops, fertile soil, and easy transport. But rivers also meant danger: floods could destroy crops, or enemies could invade along the waterways. So each civilization built defenses, armies, and laws to protect what they had built. Speaking of laws, one of the earliest known law codes came from Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi, created around 1750 BCE by King Hammurabi of Babylon. It was carved into stone for everyone to see. The idea was simple: society needed rules, and everyone should know them. Though the punishments were often harsh by today's standards, the concept of written law shaped the future of justice. As these civilizations grew, so did human imagination. Mesopotamia gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest stories, about a hero searching for immortality. Egypt gave us tales of gods like Osiris, Isis, and Ra, explaining life, death, and rebirth. The Indus Valley gave us mysterious symbols and seals, showing animals like bulls and elephants that may have been sacred. China gave us oracle bones, turtle shells, and ox bones with inscriptions used to ask questions of ancestors and gods. Civilizations also competed and connected. Traders carried goods from one region to another: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia, papyrus from Egypt, cotton from India, silk from China. Ideas traveled to new tools, new beliefs, new ways of life. Humanity was no longer just surviving, it was building a web of connections across continents. When I imagine this time, I see a world buzzing with energy. Farmers bending over fields along the Nile, scribes pressing reeds into clay in Mesopotamia, merchants loading carts in the Indus Valley, bronzesmiths hammering tools in China. People were no longer just reacting to nature, they were shaping it, organizing it, and leaving marks that would last for thousands of years. The rise of civilizations was not the end of the story, though. It was only the beginning. With cities came power, and with power came rivalries. Kingdoms fought over land and resources. Empires began to form, swallowing smaller states. And with each rise, there was also a fall. Floods, droughts, invasions, and even simple human mistakes could bring down what had been built. But in the middle of all this, one thing was clear: humans had entered a new age. From scattered bands of hunters, we had become farmers. From farmers, we had become city builders. And from city builders, we were now writing, ruling, and dreaming on a scale bigger than ever before. The rivers of Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Indus, and the Yellow River had given birth to civilizations. And from them, the story of humanity was flowing faster than ever, carrying us toward new wonders still to come.